Hello everyone, I welcome you to the CEC lecture series. I am Nupur Chawla, teaching English literature at Maitri College, Delhi University. And today's lecture is part of the ongoing series where we've been discussing about British drama. And particularly, we've been looking at the 19th century and 20th century drama. So late 19th century and 20th century drama. Today in discussion is Oscar Wilde's play, The Importance of Being Earnest, which was written in 1895. Now, I'm sure a lot of us would have heard about Oscar Wilde. He is one of the very popular playwrights who was an Irish, and he's also written a novel. He, of course, has also been a poet. So we popularly know Oscar Wilde as an Irish poet and a playwright who was born in 1854, so which is in the middle of the 19th century, and was around till 1900, that is just the beginning of the 20th century. So what we see is that he lived a short, he actually lived for a short span of time. But even during that, the writings by this, one can say playwright or poet, became incredibly famous, and he seems to be, an iconic figure when I talk about, literary figures in the late 19th century. So that's Oscar Wilde for us, an Irish poet and a playwright. We also see that how it's particularly the last decade of the 19th century, to which he is, broadly associated with. So that's the time when he was writing, when he was very, very active. Of course, he started writing a little before, but this is the time when he produced some of his most seminal works. Of course, one of those is the play in discussion today, which is titled The Importance of Being Earnest. Apart from that, he has also written a lot of different plays and also a novella, which is, called A Picture of Dorian Gray. That also is a very interesting work by Oscar Wilde. So, if we look at, the trend that he is usually associated with, he is associated with the art movement that is called as aestheticism. And this movement flourished in the late 19th century. Now, the moment I use the term aestheticism, we notice the word aesthetic over there. And what do we mean by aesthetic? Aesthetic means that I'm going to talk about something to do with beauty, something to do with, which appeals to one's senses in that sense, right? So the art movement that Wilde was a part of or is popularly associated with is aestheticism. Now, if we were to understand that what exactly is or was aestheticism, one of the foremost, principles of any work of art, be it music, be it painting, be it, literature, any work of art which is associated with this movement clearly had this one feature, that is, where it privileged the aesthetic value of that work of art over its social function. Now you see this kind of a binary between the social function and the aesthetic value is something that we will always come across when we are studying literature, or for that matter when we are discussing any art form, right? So is art meant to serve a social purpose? Is it meant to carry a message? Is it meant to educate us about certain aspects of life? Or is it supposed to be pleasure giving? Or is it supposed to be a source of entertainment, right? Or is it supposed to be that entity or that artifact which gives us pleasure by means of its beauty, right? So this, these questions pertaining to the aesthetic and the social function always remain alive whenever we are, kind of trying to study any artwork, be it literary one or belonging to any other field. So this is something which also became the crux of this art movement, that is aestheticism. But over here, of course, what we saw was that this one aspect of art was privileged, that is, where the focus was on the aspect of form, on the aspect of beauty, on the aspect of how it appeals to the reader or to the consumer, as against what message does it carry, right? So Oscar Wilde then was associated with this art movement. Now, the other thing that we must know when we talk about aestheticism is that this very popular slogan, which is associated with this movement, and it's called art for art's sake. Now, this is a phrase that you will come across a lot of times when you read literature written in the late 19th century. So now, what do we mean by art for art's sake? I think this will be best understood if I give you its opposite statement. Art for truth's sake, or art for society's sake, right? So it's like these two are kind of the opposite viewpoints on approaches to a given work of art. So, but in aestheticism, it was art for art's sake, which means that we are supposed to consume the given work for what it is, right? For the value that it has as an artifact, for the value that it has as an entity which deals with beauty, which deals with evoking certain sense experience, etc. While we are not supposed to read art to understand what is it trying to say, to understand what is it trying to tell us about the reality around, right? So when we do not focus on the message, but we focus on the aspect of beauty, the aspect of form, or in that sense, the aspect of how evocative a particular work of art is, that is what is indicated, or that is the gist of this slogan, art for art's sake, that where art is made, is prepared, is composed for the means of giving pleasure, for the means of giving pleasure through the sense of beauty. And this is something which formed the cornerstone of this art movement, which is aestheticism, right? Now, as you can see over here, Oscar Wilde, that's one of his portraits. You can see it on the screen. So that is the playwright come poet that we are talking about, and he, along with many others, of course, were associated with aestheticism. Now, if I were to tell you a little bit more about this movement so that you're able to place it, now this movement actually began in the 1860s England, right? So it started around the second half of the 19th century, okay? And it somewhat climaxed or came to its heyday or had its heyday in the late 19th century, right? So it began in 1860s England with radical artists such as William Morris, Dante Gabriel Rossetti, and several others who were part of it. It also became significantly known, as we just now discussed, through the works of Walter Pater and Oscar Wilde. So whenever we talk about Oscar Wilde as an aesthete or as a writer belonging to the aestheticism or the aesthetic art movement, we also cannot but mention Walter Pater as well, because he was another writer who popularized aestheticism in literature, right? So that's where this movement had its beginning, which was in the 60s of England. Now, if we go a little further into what exactly were the ideals that aestheticism believed in. Now, the aesthetes, or people associated with this movement, they believed in freedom, beauty, and pleasure, particularly pleasure over morality. So what we notice is that these are some of the running themes, or one can say these are some of the running attitudes that one can notice in artists associated with aestheticism. There is a very enhanced sense of freedom, right? Now, freedom of what kind? Freedom from limitations, freedom from rules, freedom from social obligations, right? So all this was kind of couched in this attitude of aestheticism. Then the other thing that we've talked about, the other word is, in fact, before I go to the next word, if we also further talk about freedom, it is also, in a way liberating. So the artists associated with this movement, and then also let's keep it in mind that we're discussing Oscar Wilde. So even Oscar Wilde then would focus more upon this idea of not being, kind of tied down by any fixities. He would question, right? And the moment we see that at the center of somebody's, aesthetic or moral universe is freedom, we automatically understand that here is a secular artist or here is a secular writer. Why? Because they approach life, they approach different issues from the standpoint of freedom and not from the standpoint of tradition, morality, or what one can say even convention, right? So this is something which is a defining feature also of Oscar Wilde's writings. Now, apart from freedom, the next word which is most commonly associated with the aesthetes is beauty, which we just now talked about. That how there are very distinctive elements of beauty. There are very distinctive elements where we see the painter, the writer, the artist pay special attention to how something is composed or how something is represented. Now, in the case of Oscar Wilde, if we notice, you will see that the language is very, very well crafted in that sense. And I'm sure that even if even if for those who may not have read a work by Oscar Wilde, but you would definitely have come across some quotation or another by Oscar Wilde. Now, why is that? Because in his works, we see a lot of quotable quotes. The way he crafts his sentences. In fact, he's kind of also called as a master of epigrams. Now, what is an epigram? Epigram is where you have a short statement using fewer words, but which conveys a lot, right? So this becomes an aspect of a very distinctive formal element. We see that he pays attention to using language a certain way so that it becomes, very, very terse in that sense and also conveys a lot more than the number of words that it uses. So therefore, the idea of beauty then is at the center of the works of the aesthetes. And the other thing that I mentioned was the idea of pleasure. Now, again, you see, the moment we talk about, if you look at this, that the words freedom and pleasure are quite interlinked, right? Pleasure and freedom was the link. That when you pleasure means what? Indulging in sense experience, right? And when do you indulge in sense experience? When there is no limitation of propriety holding you back. So that's the kind of value system that you will see which drives these writers and these artists. And again, I clearly mentioned that in the aesthetes there's an emphasis on pleasure over morality. Now, why? Because morality is something which works to limit individuals, which puts boundaries around one's behavior, about what you can and cannot do, about what is considered to be right in society or not. But on the other hand, the aesthetes did not go into the concerns of morality. They did not go into the concerns of right and wrong, good or bad. Instead, they only engaged with the idea of freedom, beauty, and pleasure, right? So this is broadly stating what we understand as aestheticism, which is the art movement that Oscar Wilde is most often associated with. Now, because it's a very important, conceptual marker, we need to make one more point over here. That is how the aesthetes had an intersection with the pre-Raphaelites. Now, when you talk about Oscar Wilde, these are some of the terms which will keep occurring, which will keep reappearing, right? So one, of course, is aestheticism or the aesthetes. The other word is pre-Raphaelites. Now, again, who were the pre-Raphaelites? Pre-Raphaelites were actually a group of painters, critics, and artists. Two of the most popular ones are D.G. Rossetti and William Hunt, right? So again, just like the aesthetes, this was also a group of artists, critics, and painters, right? Now, what was actually primarily the Pre-Raphaelites, so to say, cohort is premised in the works of a few painters, right? So their values or their driving principles are associated with painting. So what we see is that in Pre-Raphaelites there is a tendency to return to detail in painting, detailing in colors, right, and also complex composition. So we see that the Pre-Raphaelites focused on detail in their representations. The colors were very vibrant, and they also kind of tried to emulate the complex composition of Italian art. So these were some of the distinguishing features of the works of the Pre-Raphaelites. Now, if I particularly look at the term Pre-Raphaelites, we very clearly see the word pre, which means before, and Raphaelites has the word Raphael in it. Now, Raphael was actually, a sculptor artist, right? So when I talk about the Pre-Raphaelites, I say that it is that group of artists who rejected the mechanical approach to art which developed after Raphael and Michelangelo. Now, as we all are aware, that Michelangelo is that sculptor very popularly known for his sculpture David in the Renaissance. So, all art that came after that is considered to be somewhat mechanical. So, this group of artists called themselves the Pre-Raphaelites in order to distinguish themselves from the mechanical art which ultimately came into being. So, what do we notice here? There's a very clear intersection between the way Pre-Raphaelites operated in the field of art and the way the aesthetes operated in the field of literature, right? Where there was attention to detail, bright colors, complexity of composition in Pre-Raphaelites. Likewise, in the aesthetes, they dealt with the question of pleasure, with the question of beauty, with the question of aesthetic, etc. Right? So whenever we talk about Oscar Wilde, these two terms automatically come in conversation, and we must be aware of the slight distinction and also the overlap between these two conceptual terms, right? So I hope that the first part is clear to everyone that Oscar Wilde was the Irish playwright, poet, who also wrote this novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, and next we saw that how he wrote in the last decade of the 19th century, and also the fact that he is associated with this movement called aestheticism, and we discussed what aestheticism is and how is it different from the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, right? Now, having discussed this these initial points, we come to a brief idea of the text that is in discussion today, and that is the play written by Oscar Wilde, which is titled The Importance of Being Earnest, and it was first performed in London in the year 1895. So again, this play directly situates Oscar Wilde and his work in the last decade of the 19th century. Now, if you just look at the title first, right? The Importance of Being Earnest. Now, if you've not read the play, you will first of all, kind of try to interpret the word earnest. What does earnest mean? Earnest is a literary term. In a literal sense, earnest means somebody who's sincere, somebody who's pure of intention, etc. And so when we say the importance of being earnest, so the title seems to tell us that the play will talk about what is the significance of sincerity. What is the importance of being sincere, or what is the importance of being truthful, or what is the importance of being, well-intentioned, etc. Now, one can notice that the title of the play itself, kind of sets the tone of the play. It seems to be, one can also kind of say that the title is somewhat deceptive. Why? It seems to deploy wordplay. Because, and when I say wordplay, it means that what the title seems to be saying on the surface is quite different from actually what is implied there, right? So, at the surface, you might feel that this is a didactic play talking about why should one be earnest or sincere, etc. But then when you think about it and you remember that it's a play written in the last decade of the 19th century by the aesthete Oscar Wilde, can it exactly be didactic? Of course not, because he is part of the movement which is aestheticism, and whose slogan was what? Art for art's sake, and not art for society's sake, and not art for truth's sake. So we right at the outset understand that there is an obvious wordplay in the title of the play itself. So what does it actually mean? What do we mean by importance? What do we mean by earnest? These questions, of course, you're supposed to keep in mind, because this is what raises your curiosity, and these questions will be answered only when you read the text, right? So even before we enter the text, this idea needs to be very, very clear. Now, of course, to give you a sense now, to take you still further, now that I've piqued your curiosity, let me also, answer it to a bit. Now, when you look at the word earnest, the title is actually derived from a fictitious persona, okay, which is adopted by a character in the play, and this fictitious persona is called as earnest. Okay, so what do I mean by a fictitious persona? That there is this fictitious person which is created by a character, and he keeps on referring to that person whenever he wants to avoid a situation, right? So for instance, he's meant to maybe have dinner with one of the extended family members, but what does this character do? He says that, oh, my brother Ernest is unwell, I need to go and meet him. But is there a person Ernest in real? There's none. So it is nothing but a fictitious persona. So we see that that's what the word earnest over here implies, that it is derived from this idea that how, in the play, we notice a fictitious persona which is adopted by a character to avoid social responsibility and obligation. Okay, we'll of course go into further details of this as we discuss this text further at length in the eventual part of the lectures. But let's first understand the title, that how in the title itself there's wordplay. It operates at two levels. What it seems to be saying is not exactly what it means, and this also kind of sets the tone for what we are in for when we actually go and read the play, right? So the other thing which is also kind of introduced just when we look at the title of this play is that how the language use is then witty, right? The language use is not conventional. It clearly has this design behind it, whereby the playwright likes to say something while mean quite a different thing. And this becomes the crux of wit as well. So that's why we say that Oscar Wilde is a master of wit, where you try to say something or where you seemingly say something, but you actually mean something quite different. And that becomes, so wit not only in the sense of something which makes you laugh, but also wit in the sense of something which is very cleverly worded, right? So all this is an important part of this play written by Oscar Wilde. What are the themes of the text? How does wit unfold? What do we know about this character Ernest? What about this fictitious persona? How does that unfold? All of that is what we're going to discuss in the next part of our lecture. But in this part, the aim was to understand or to know about Oscar Wilde, the playwright and the poet, to know about the art movement that he's associated with, and to also understand what are the different features of the movement. And likewise, thereafter, we looked at the title of the text in discussion, and to just get a sense of what lies ahead of us when we actually go on to read it. So when we discuss in the next lecture, you will understand the different niceties of what the title only seems to suggest. Thank you.